After the initial rush to enlist at the outbreak of the war, recruitment slowed. Following the evacuation of Dunkirk in the spring of 1940, the federal government enacted the National Resources Mobilization Act. This included the provision that all single men would be eligible for conscription for home defense as of July 15, 1940. It is worthy to note the increase in marriage licenses that the city saw on July 14th. Under the compulsory training plan, Brantford was selected as a training center. Thus, the No. 20 Canadian Army Basic Training Camp was constructed on the Glebe lands, a 97-acre tract of land south of Cockburn Street between Rawdon and Mohawk Park. The property was owned by Six Nations and then rented to the Department of National Defense for $1 a year. Conscripts began arriving for training sessions in October 1940, and the sessions began as 1 month and later expanded to 3 months long. In April 1940, it was announced that a flight school would be established 6 miles from Brantford on the Burford Road with auxiliary air posts in Birch and Hagersville. The No. 5 Service Flying School opened in November 1940. Over 2,000 servicemen graduated from the No. 5, as well as a detachment of the CWAAF, the Canadian Women's Auxiliary Air Force. The Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division was a non-combatant element of the Royal Canadian Air Force, which was active during the Second World War. This division's original role was to replace the male Air Force personnel so that they would be available for combat-related duties. First called the Canadian Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the name was changed to the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division in 1942. And the No. 5 Flying School closed in November 1944. Brantford was one of the most significant manufacturing centers in the country at the time and played a vital role in Canada's commitment to wartime industry. Early in the war, Kitchen Overall and Slingsby's received orders for uniforms, a commodity that was in short supply at the beginning of the hostilities. Massey Harris, Cockshutts, and Brantford Coach and Body all produced shell casings, bombers, and motorized vehicles. And Massey's and Cockshutts continued to produce their regular line of goods in addition to the wartime production. With the enlistment of many men and the expansion of industry in the city, there was a severe labor shortage, and as such, a large number of women entered the workforce. Between September 1942 and June 1945, the National Selective Service placed over 14,000 women in all types of positions in the city. Many were local women, but many more were recruited from Western Canada and the East Coast. And this did not aid to the already present housing shortage within the city of Brantford. Hostels were established for single workers, and old factories were partitioned into temporary quarters nicknamed the Ryan Apartments, after the city's mayor at the time, John Ryan. Advertisements in local newspapers also called on residents to rent out their spare bedrooms. Eventually, a series of small wood-framed houses were constructed by Wartime Housing, and they were intended to only be temporary quarters, as a condition to their approval was that they would be removed after the war. And as we all know, many are still occupied today. During this time, the Community Wartime Recreation Council established the city's first free daycare for working mothers, as well as drama and photography clubs, lecture series, darts tournaments, and sports leagues for local workers. The worsening situation in Europe in 1940 prompted calls for a home guard within the communities across the country. In May 1940, the federal government called for volunteers to serve in a Veterans Home Defense Force, and over 700 men from Brantford joined. These were all First World War veterans that were under 50 years of age. In addition to the Home Guard, a Civilian Defense Committee, an ARA or ARP, was also formed in February 1941, as Brantford was listed as a vulnerable point in Ontario. Over 400 volunteers were secured. However, by September of the same year, this designation was dropped and the committee decided to disband. City Council encouraged the group not to, and in January 1943, Brantford was reclassified as vulnerable due to the large nature of industry taking place within city limits. as well as being theoretically in range of German bombers. In 1943, this group consisted of roughly 1,000 volunteers, and duties included the following: fire watcher, nurses' aides, a driver's corps, first aid, auxiliary firemen and police, an air raid warden, decontamination squad, raid repair, and demolition clearance crews. Posters and newspaper articles constantly reminded citizens not to talk about vital war topics, like factory production or troop departure, likely out of a fear of spies and/or collaborators. By June 1940, police in the city had responded to over 100 calls reporting suspicious behavior or suspected disloyalty. However, all of these proved unfounded, and many were attributed to spite or pre-existing neighborly disputes. Many local businesses benefited from the construction and supply to the bases built in the city. In January 1944, a report estimated that 25% of the food bought for Camp 20 was bought in Brantford, along with canteen supplies, fuel, and other materials. As such, citizens and service groups made a special effort to make the stay of visiting military personnel more enjoyable. The Brantford Public Utilities Commission allowed active service personnel to ride the buses for free. Other local groups finished the mess halls, sewed curtains, and stocked the libraries at the bases. And a local construction firm even excavated a swimming pool behind the air base. The Canadian Legion opened the War Services Club, and the Brantford Citizens War Services Committee ran the Maple Leaf Club. At both, dances and other entertainment opportunities took place. Through these events, close personal ties were created between visiting servicemen and individual families in the city. For example, the 89th Batteries from Woodstock, New Brunswick, were stationed in Brantford in January 1940. By March, several announcements of marriages between Brantford girls and members of the 89th appeared in the Expositor before the battery departed in April. Local service clubs also took care to send Christmas parcels and cigarettes to the servicemen from Brant County who were stationed overseas. Their generosity extended to the crew of the HMCS Brantford, who were considered adopted members of the community. In order to direct sufficient supplies to the war effort, and to try and ensure a fair distribution of scarce commodities, the Wartime Prices and Trade Board introduced rationing. Initially, this was all voluntary, and advertisements appeared warning against hoarding. Quote, "The hoarder, public enemy number one. People who buy more of anything than they need, and merchants who encourage them to do so, are sabotaging the war effort and are therefore considered public enemies." Unquote. Ration books were introduced in 1942. Each household was allotted 3/4 of a pound of sugar per person per week, and sugar bowls disappeared from restaurants to prevent customers from stocking up. You had to choose whether to surrender your coupon for 1 ounce of tea, the equivalent of 10 tea bags, or 4 ounces of coffee, about 12 cups. In 1943, meat rationing came into effect, which allowed for 1 ounce per person per day, 5 days a week. Meatless Tuesday became commonplace at restaurants, and the Expositor listed a group of recipes that used eggs as meat substitutes. These included golden glow eggs, egg and mushroom patties, and snow eggs. Families were encouraged to plant victory gardens in order to supplement their food supplies. The city provided vacant lots to residents who did not have their own available land. There was a shortage of farm labor as well, so high school students were often encouraged to spend their summer holidays picking fruit and vegetables or working in local canning factories. The supply of gasoline, coal, rubber, and cloth for civilian purposes was also severely restricted. The Expositor ran advertisements that encouraged carpooling as a patriotic duty to save gasoline and wear on tires. Brantford coal dealers announced that, quote, "Trucks running without a full load must be stopped. All orders for fuel must be placed 24 hours ahead so that they can plan the route with the least mileage," unquote. And even before Japan's entry into the war, silk was in short supply. In 1940, the government instructed manufacturers to reduce the content of silk in stockings to a maximum of 50%. And as such, stockings became scarce in shops. Articles ran in the Expositor that described women painting on stockings, complete with the seam down the back drawn in eyeliner. A rainstorm would give a whole new meaning to a run in your stockings. Not only were vital materials rationed, but the local Council of Women ran salvage campaigns, which collected vast quantities of these materials. They started in June 1940 with a campaign for scrap metal, but soon expanded to collect paper, rags, and rubber. A large brown paper victory bag would be distributed to each household, and those who could afford it would be asked to pay 10 cents. Volunteers picked up the bags when they were full and sorted the contents at a salvage depot. From June 1940 to March 1942, 701 tons of paper, 75 tons of rags, 108 tons of scrap metal, and 21 tons of rubber and other miscellaneous materials were collected. The sale of these items brought in over $9,600 after expenses were deducted. In September 1940, J.G. Gardner, Minister of National War Services, visited Brantford to address the Board of Trade. He inspected the salvage operation and later sent a civil servant to do a thorough study. The Governor General's wife also sponsored a conference to encourage the spread of this movement. Brantford women fielded so many inquiries about the program from communities across the country that they developed their own standard mimeographed reply. Citizens were also encouraged to contribute to victory bonds, war saving certificates, and war stamps. The federal government launched 9 loan campaigns, all with catchy slogans and publicity events. A mock air raid in 1941 was designed to impress on the citizens what their compatriots in England were enduring.